How do you avoid offending Indigenous people? If you've ever been worried about offending Indigenous people through your words or actions, then this video is for you. Keep watching to learn 7 ways to avoid offending Indigenous people. Hi there, I'm Mallory from tribaltradeco.com. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell for new videos every week on smudging, Indigenous culture, and Native teachings. Have you ever offended an Indigenous person in your life? Or felt afraid to ask questions that you were curious about out of fear of offending the person? Learning about another culture can be challenging, no matter how good your intentions are. Sometimes you can still offend people by not having enough knowledge or awareness of that particular background. That's why the best thing you can do is make sure you are as informed, aware, and open-minded as you possibly can be. How you cultivate your own understanding is the first step toward avoiding potentially awkward or offensive interactions. Here at Tribal Trade Co., we want to bring as many people together as possible. We've helped thousands of people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, learn about Indigenous culture, experience it together, and utilize Indigenous teachings in their day-to-day lives. That's why today we're going to share with you 7 ways that you can avoid offending Indigenous people. Keep watching to find out. Avoiding offensive interactions or encounters is really all about education and awareness. The more informed you are, the less likely you are to offend someone. These 7 ways to avoid offending Indigenous people will ask you to identify some of your own intentions or prejudices, learn about new topics, and explore the history of Indigenous people in Canada and around the world. The more intentionally you engage with these suggestions, the more successful you will be. Now on to the 7 ways. The first way to avoid offending Indigenous people is to learn the truth behind Indigenous history in Canada. The first way to avoid offending Indigenous people is to acknowledge that what you've been taught about Indigenous people in Canada might not be true. Indigenous people have had a long, complicating, and sometimes dark history in Canada that not everyone knows about. It's important to learn about that history and discover the truth of Indigenous people in Canada. If you want a good place to start, check out this video right here where I discuss some of Canada's true history with Indigenous people. Now, the second way to avoid offending Indigenous people is to learn about the diverse background of Indigenous communities, cultures, tribes, and nations. Did you know that not all Indigenous communities, tribes, or cultures are the same? It's important to acknowledge that there are differences between Indigenous people. You never know who you're talking to, and you don't want to offend them by assuming that they have the same culture or beliefs as another Indigenous person. Teachings, beliefs, values, and traditions differ from culture to culture. No 2 Indigenous people are truly the same. You can avoid offending an Indigenous person by acknowledging and even learning about all the different backgrounds, communities, and cultures that exist. The third way to avoid offending Indigenous people is to acknowledge any of your assumptive stereotypes, judgments, or prejudices. When you assume all Indigenous people are the same or have the same beliefs, it's also easy to adopt certain stereotypes or prejudices. We all do this, but the important thing is learning to undo any of those learned stereotypes. Consider how you've been taught to think about or treat Indigenous people. How have your experiences shaped your opinion? Now, how can you shift that perspective so that you don't place unnecessary judgments or stereotypes onto others? You can avoid an offensive encounter with an Indigenous person by not making assumptions, or by not making judgments, or letting yourself fall into the trap of believing in stereotypes. One really good way to do this is to learn the diversity of the culture and the backgrounds, which will make it a lot easier to do this. Now, the fourth way to avoid offending Indigenous people is to develop basic awareness of Indigenous culture. You don't have to be an expert, but learning even the basics of Indigenous culture will help you to better understand and communicate with Indigenous people. You can start simple with basic teachings, basic traditions, and values. You don't have to practice Indigenous culture yourself to have a general awareness of it. Get started with this simple video that gives you 4 ways to learn Indigenous culture. Now, what are some roadblocks that you've experienced when trying to have a conversation with someone outside of your own culture? Let me know in the comments below. Now, once you've cultivated a general understanding of Indigenous culture and history, it's time to put your knowledge to practice. Now, the 5th way to avoid offending Indigenous people is to learn how to communicate effectively with Indigenous people. The next thing that you want to do is learn how to effectively communicate with Indigenous people. This means ensuring you are respectful, kind, empathetic, and an active listener. Keep in mind that you might not know everything about Indigenous culture and be open to new ideas and new concepts. Acknowledge that the person you're speaking with might have something to teach you. Open, honest, and empathetic communication is important, and it will help you both from offending each other. Now on to the 6th way to avoid offending Indigenous people. Only 2 strategies left, guys. The 6th way to avoid offending Indigenous people is to be aware of potentially harmful questions. Don't forget that Indigenous history can be tricky, dark, and even traumatic. Some people might not feel comfortable discussing certain topics or even answering certain questions, and that's okay. Be aware that any person has the right to say that they don't want to answer your questions about their culture. It's not that person's responsibility to teach you. Open and honest conversations are amazing, but just be aware that there might be some questions that feel hurtful or off limits for Indigenous people. To learn more about what some potential questions might be triggering to Indigenous people, check out this video right here. Now on to the 7th and final way for this video to avoid offending Indigenous people, and this is to be aware of your intentions when you're trying to connect with the Indigenous community. Finally, try to identify your intentions when you're attempting to connect with the Indigenous community. Intention means identifying why you want to learn more about Indigenous culture and why you want to connect with the culture or Indigenous people. Make sure you are connecting for the right reasons, or make sure that your intentions are for the right reasons. Your intentions should come from a place of empathy, understanding, and most importantly, a place of wanting to strengthen connections in the Indigenous community and spread the truth behind the Indigenous culture and how incredibly beautiful and healing the Indigenous culture really is. Now, these 7 strategies should help you avoid offending Indigenous people. But as a bonus tip, keep in mind that you cannot completely avoid offending everyone. There's always the chance that you and another person simply might not connect. The important thing is to just practice kindness in all interactions. To start learning about Indigenous culture, check out our other videos on this YouTube channel. If you want to learn more about the Indigenous culture, how you can be a strong ally, and how you can avoid offending Indigenous people by becoming more aware, make sure that you subscribe to this channel and check out more of our videos, as that is what we talk about on this channel every single week. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have an incredible day, and we'll see you next time.